Good morning. This is another Saturday at Anti-Fragility Health at our weekly Saturday workshops. Thank you for joining us from wherever you're joining. My name is Charles Sine, the CEO of Anti-Fragility Health. We deeply appreciate you joining us this morning as we continue to practice social distancing within the lockdown as that begins to reduce across the world. So thanks for joining, and I hope you're going to enjoy our workshop today. So our workshop, as I promised last week, is going to be on cardiometabolic imbalances. It's a very big topic. Can you take that phone? It's a very big topic. And so what I have decided to do is to break the topic into 4 different sessions, right? And those 4 sessions, are going to cover the following 4 topics. So we're going to start session 1 with an overview of what we call the multifactorial nature of chronic illness, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at the overall broad spectrum that defines cardiometabolic imbalances and illnesses. Next week, we're going to go take a deep look into the diagnostics. And what are the diagnostics, right? It's around some very critical measurements around cardio performance and metabolic performance, and that's why we call it cardiometabolic imbalances. And some of the big things, myths we'll be talking about are measurements of LDL, HDL, triglycerides, and cholesterol measurements. And we have some very good, powerful vendor partners that we partner with, Boston Heart Diagnostics and Vibrant America, that give us really comprehensive data on this diagnostics for cardiometabolic. And then session 3 and session 4, we're going to really focus on interventions, the lifestyle interventions, and some of the prescriptions that are used for addressing cardiometabolic. Same thing with session 4, we'll go into some of the new practices that we are looking at, things like poly-NVA and plaque-X for actually reducing plaque accumulation in the arteries and how that is helping overall. But before we go into that, I always take a step back and say, let's look at the 6 causes of chronic illness. So always important for us to take a step back and actually say, what is really causing chronic illness, right? There are 6 things that cause chronic illness. We repeated this again and again and again. Number 1 is aging, just the process of aging. We've dealt it in former workshops here. What are the hallmarks of aging? Number 2 is stress. And today we're going to really explore this whole issue of stress and really look at it because in our analysis, as we look at overall risk, we are finding out that stress is actually a critical beginning point for most cardiometabolic illnesses. And then toxicity, which is the other big one, toxicity addresses a lot of underlying issues of that cause a lot of stress for us. Go ahead, thank you. Then we want to look at infections and allergens. Infections in themselves are at a significant level in creating a lot of issues with regard to overall chronic illness. Then we want to look at nutrient deficiencies. We know that not having enough nutrients can be very challenging with regard to overall chronic illness development. And then the last one, which we explore whenever we look at your overall issues, are issues of genetic risk, right? So let's begin. Don't give the handouts yet. I'll tell you when, okay? So let's look at the comprehensive set of imbalances. Why? Sorry, because if I give you handouts, then you're distracted by the handout rather than listening to me. Okay, guys? Thank you. All right, so let's look at the 10 imbalances that really people struggle with regard to chronic illness. And that's the big one we're going to discuss today. Number one, cardiometabolic. The second one is immune. We've talked a lot about that, especially with the coronavirus. The third one is gastrointestinal. The fourth one, stress. And we're really going to start with that today when we look at overall stress. The fourth one is musculoskeletal. The fifth one is hormones. The sixth is energy. The seventh is circulation. The eighth is toxicity. And then we get to cognition and the others. The reason why chronic illness is so challenging and the reason why there is no medication is ever going to be able to be found is because everybody has some amount of these imbalances inside of them. So it's very, very complicated. So we call it the multifactorial nature of chronic illness. There are so many competing factors that are actually individualized for every person that it's very difficult to say you have this. Modern medicine has made a big mistake. So what modern medicine has done, it says you have diseases. So it says you have diabetes. But what diabetes actually is a combination of these 10 imbalances. What arthritis is a combination of these imbalances. What Alzheimer's is a combination of these imbalances. Just different levels of it affecting different people differently. That's really at the core reason why chronic illness is such a big challenge. So let's start by saying that our proposal at Anti-Fragility Health is that stress is really at the core of the beginning of chronic illness. Because when we look at people who live long, people we call centenarians, they live in what we call the blue zones, right? We know what the blue zones are. We actually have one in Southern California, right? It's in the Loma Linda area. So we actually have blue zones. And what are the critical characteristics of people who live in blue zones? They live for more than 100 years without any chronic illnesses. And that's a very, and there are about 8 or 9 places around the world. We have Okinawa in Japan. We have Costa Rica. We have a couple of islands in the Mediterranean. And so these places, we have found that people live to 100, 105, 110, and they die in their sleep with no chronic illnesses. That is teaching us, right, as we look back, why are the other people like us? Why do we develop chronic illness so early? And that's where you take a step back and you realize that what has happened over the last 100 years that has significantly changed in our lives is stress. I think that in those days, people used to get infections, they used to get toxicity, they used to age. Most people died from infections, what we call communicable diseases, like viruses. That's what killed people a long time ago. But now, what kills 90% of people is what we call non-communicable diseases. And what are non-communicable diseases? Are chronic illnesses like diabetes, that you can't give somebody else, right? That's why they call them non-communicable diseases. Communicable diseases are like the virus. You can, if you sneeze, you can give somebody else, right? And so before we developed non-communicable diseases, which we now call chronic illnesses, people used to die only from communicable diseases, which were mostly infections, bacteria, and viruses, or accidents, as usual. But today, what is the highest thing that kills Americans? Is chronic illness. Cancer, cardiometabolic, and some other illnesses around that. That's what kills most people today. So what's the big thing that has changed over the last 50 years? We think it's stress. So let's talk about stress, and let's see how stress actually begins at the beginning to drive most of what drives cardiometabolic health. So we'll start in the blue corner, if you have the chart, with what we call perceived stress. So let's look at the structures within perceived stress. You know, most people don't know they're stressed, but perceived stress is the stress that we generate ourselves. So let's look at that. So the first component of perceived stress is what we call mental and emotional stress. And there are three of them that we identified, right? Relationships, that's the big one that stresses everybody else. Why? Because we're all afraid that nobody's going to love us, or they're going to leave us, or that we're not good enough for them. Everyone suffers from that stress. The other one is lack of control. What is lack of control? It goes back to the concept that I developed called the freedom box. If you look inside the freedom box, there are 5 elements. There's money, there's health, there is knowledge, there's relationship, and there's time. And inside here, the size of this box is your freedom box. So the loss of control people suffer is they don't have enough money, they don't have good health, they don't have enough knowledge, they don't have good relationships, or they don't have enough time. So those 5 factors, if you're in control of them, then there is no stress. But if you're not in control or you lose control of any of those 5 factors, then you lose control, now life becomes stressful. That's why most poor people have a lot of stress, right? Because of what actually generally happens, right? Okay, come on, guys. Come on. We're good. So for those people watching, we have IV patients, and we're just moving to get to the IV patients, okay? So thank you for your patience as we let them go through. Okay, so let's continue. So the third one around emotional and mental stress is actually burnout, right? What Dr. Yi will call adrenal fatigue, right? People are just burnt out from persistent stress, and they don't have enough cortisol to keep their overall performance going. So that's really the big area of stress. But let's look at some of the other things that drive stress. So we look at these hormones like DHEA, pregnenolone, which is the underlying driver for progesterone, AOLA. Those things are driving what we call neurosteroids. These are enzymes and cofactors and hormones that actually drive our underlying what we'll call anxiety or depression. Okay? And then we have the things that make us happy or drive our anxiety also: serotonin, dopamine, GABA, and glutamate. These are the things that you would typically encounter if you exercise or if you're happy. They actually drive whether you're happy, and a lot of these are all brain chemicals. So stress, perceived, just talking about perceived stress, you now understand why we call it the silent killer. It is really at the core of driving our lives, right? When we lived in villages, on mountaintops, and had an easy life, there are lots of stories about people who moved to the blue zones and actually recovered from cancer without doing anything else. And the critical thing they changed was just really stress. There were some other changes, but so stress, as we know, is what we call the silent killer. Let's look at the second area of stress that most people are not aware of. And that's what we call the circadian disruption. I hope everybody has this. We've posted this on the Facebook site, so you should have access to that. The circadian disruption is our inability to sleep for 8 hours when the sun is down. Sleeping when the sun is up disrupts the circadian control, rhythms, as we call them. So some people think, oh, I just sleep whenever I choose. No, we were supposed to biologically sleep when the sun is down, because the whole clock mechanism in our architecture takes its guidance from two things that drive our circadian architecture: light and food. Those are the two big signals of life: light and food. So people who live in areas where for 6 months there is no natural light suffer from circadian dysregulation. People who are starving have issues also with sleep, right? So most of us know that we cannot sleep well when we're hungry. Isn't that amazing? That if you're hungry, you cannot sleep. You start dreaming about the refrigerator, all the Korean drama you've watched, and all the food they have been serving, right? So let's look at the things that affect sleep. Let's look at the sleep issues. Sleep apnea. Many of my patients have sleep apnea. What is sleep apnea? The ability, and you can track this with a lot of our modern gadgets today, where you sleep and for a certain amount of time, you are not breathing. And it's a very dangerous thing for most people. Very dangerous for a lot of people, because that lack of oxygen to the brain when you have sleep apnea is very, very dangerous. And that sleep apnea is one of the reasons why people don't sleep well or don't sleep enough hours, right? And so sleep apnea, the second one is pain, right? A lot of people are suffering from pain, whether it's back pain, hip pain, joint pain. So pain is one of the big challenges why we don't sleep well. The next one is coffee. I know a lot of people like coffee. Coffee is actually good for you, but if coffee is affecting your sleep, then you need to stop drinking coffee. What are the three other things? Shift work. A lot of nurses who work night shift develop cardiometabolic problems because of that lack of rhythm in their sleep. So shift work, we know that people who do shift work actually die much earlier than people who do not. So if you are somebody who spends more time working at night than sleeping, you're actually reducing your life. Jet lag, very challenging on the rhythm. Every time I travel, when I come back, it takes me a couple of days to actually get back into my sleep rhythm. These are very important things. And then daylight savings, right? It's very interesting these days. I wake up at 5 a.m. and it's already light outside, right? Or you want to go to bed and then the sun doesn't set until 7:30 p.m. And then in the winter, you know, we have a different cycle. So daylight savings also affects how people sleep. So these are the circadian disruption is one of the biggest challenges in causing stress. And a lot of people are not aware of it because they just think, well, that's how I am. And so a lot of our patients who come here suffer from sleep problems. And typically, these are people who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And typically, we try to address them by addressing what the underlying sleep issues are. And you know that sleep disruption is a big signal for a lot of chronic illnesses. So let's look at the next set. And then I'm going to try and connect a lot of this into what we call the beginnings of cardiometabolic issues. How these things lead to cardiometabolic issues. Let's look at what we call inflammatory signals, right? If you look at all these things that drive inflammation, most of them are connected with the GI architecture. So let's look at GI inflammation, and that's caused by you not having good bacteria or not taking your probiotics and your prebiotics and therefore having a bacterial balance, or what we call bacterial diversity in your GI, which then causes inflammation. And that inflammation actually causes stress. Then there's arthritis, then there are cardiovascular issues, there are skin problems, psoriasis and eczema and all of those things. Then there are allergies, and then there are infectious diseases, which are all inflammatory. As you know, COVID-19 attacks mostly cells that are inflamed. They call them inflammasomes. So the COVID-19 spike protein actually lands on cells that are already inflamed. That's why one of the directives for treating or prevention of COVID-19 is for you to take anti-inflammatory. So we take SPM, and fish oils are very critical as a way for preventing you from getting infected by coronavirus, because again, the virus lands and loves cells that are already inflamed, right? So that's why infectious diseases are very challenging when you already have inflammatory signals. Part of inflammation comes from obesity. What's obesity? It's when you eat more calories than your body requires, and therefore the body is forced to store the extra calories as fat. And where does it store these calories as fat? It stores them in three places. One, it stores them in the fatty cells, and the belly has most of the fatty cells. Or number two, it stores them in the liver. That's why we have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And most people who have diabetes or high blood pressure or cardiometabolic also have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease because of the accumulation of fat in those, and that's what we call visceral fat, which we know it's the more dangerous fat than the adipose fat, which is the fat that is on the outside. So obesity is a critical driver for both what we call the glycemic dysregulation and the inflammatory signals. So now let's look at the glycemic dysregulation. What's glycemic dysregulation? It is the dysregulation that's caused by the imbalance of sugar in the blood. It's very important you understand this. The body does not like having too much sugar in the blood or too little sugar in the blood. So whenever you go to your doctor, they're going to measure your fasting glucose. Your fasting glucose is supposed to be between 90 and 70. Even though between that, we don't want a sugar profile over a 24-hour period that's going up and down, because it causes significant what we call glycemic risk. That's why a lot of people are encouraged to go for low carbohydrate diets or low sugar diets, because glycemic dysregulation, as you can see, it is one of the biggest drivers of stress. And in some ways, it is stress that feeds itself. The more you're stressed, the more you want to eat sugar. The more you eat sugar, the more you're stressed. The more you're stressed, the more you want to eat sugar, right? It is a really dangerous hell that you could descend into, because it reinforces each other. So let's look at the things that drive that. Already we identified obesity, and these are choices. Obesity is not something that was visited to you from heaven. It's because you eat too much. In the olden days, it was very important, and if you look at the old teaching, that low-calorie diets are the critical way for you to live a long life. So if you eat too much, and we were not supposed to eat 3 meals a day, it's the white man that taught us that bullshit. You're supposed to only eat when you're hungry, and only eat in the daylight. It's very important. These are very important things. You only eat in the daylight. Why? Because that's when metabolism is optimized. If you eat at night, the body has other work to do. So what does it do? All the sugar in the blood, it stores it immediately as fat. It doesn't have time to deal with the metabolism. So no eating after 7 p.m. You must eat only in the daylight, right? And that's the key driver for you managing your blood sugar. This is one of the most important issues in really taking control of your health. Unfortunately, television and electricity has deceived us into thinking we can eat late at night. In the old culture, if you go to the villages, they cook dinner around 5, 6 p.m., they eat, and by 8 p.m., everybody's gone to bed. We have developed a very bad culture where most of us are awake late at night, and therefore we make those trips to the refrigerator. So let's look at the things that drive that. If you look at the outside of that circle, poor diet choices. You see, if you're stressed already and you can't sleep and you have inflammation, you are going to eat lousy shit. You're going to eat sugar or chocolate or those sweet things because it makes you feel good for one moment. And yet it causes stress in your bloodstream, which you're not aware of. Meal timing. You must eat mostly in the daylight hours. And that's why it's always good to eat from about 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. That's what we call the most optimized time for you to eat, because then the food is fully metabolized before you go to bed. If you take things like meat or protein, it takes 6 hours to metabolize meat or protein. So if you eat Korean barbecue at 6 p.m., what do you think is going to happen to that barbecue all night when you're sleeping in your stomach? Right? It's going to sit there, and when you wake up in the morning, you'll be like, what happened? Why am I groggy? Because all that protein is sitting inside your stomach, not metabolized, because the body was doing something else during the night. It's very important, guys. So what are the challenges that we then develop? We then develop things like insulin resistance. What is insulin resistance? When the body is tired of producing insulin because you're eating too much sugar all the time. The pancreatic architecture, they call them the islets of Langerhans, produce insulin every time they smell sugar in the blood. Once there's sugar in the blood, they produce insulin. Over time, the insulin is tired. The pancreas are tired. You eat sugar in the morning, you eat sugar in the afternoon, you eat sugar in the night, and you also eat sugar in your sleep. So the pancreas really gets tired with this bullshit sugar coming all the time. Our ancestors did not have sugar. They only had sugar from the fruits. And the fruits were not always in season. So you see how we've punished ourselves? We always have apples. We always have oranges. We always have papaya. That's not the way it runs. You were supposed to eat fruits only when they're in season, not all year round. So we've built architectures. That's why some people say to me, why can't I eat fruits? Well, because you cannot eat fruits year round. Oranges were supposed to come and go. Persimmons were supposed to come and go. And in other cultures, we dry them. And in the drying process, we actually convert the sugars to more complex sugars. Or we ferment them, right? That's how we used to store. Now we put it in the fridge and we always have oranges. Very dangerous. So fruits in themselves have become a big sugar danger for us, because we cannot be eating fruits year-round. And most of us now who live in America don't even know what season fruits are supposed to be out, because the fruits are always available. And so there's a lot of confusion. So when you look at stress, most people, it's really complicated stress. Stress, you see the brain is at the center because the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, underneath it the pituitary, and the adrenal, they call it the HPA axis, are the key managers of stress. And that is what is killing us. Everything we do is causing stress. So if you look around this, look at your life, you see that this almost defines our lives. We have problems with sleep. We have problems with perceived stress. We have a lot of inflammatory issues because we all eat out. None of us cook anymore. And we don't know what the people are cooking with. We don't know how the quality of what they're cooking with. And we cannot just deal with sugar. You know, a bowl of rice is 10 spoons of sugar. I know it's tough for me also to give up that bowl of rice. But think about it. That bowl of rice is 10 spoons of sugar. And so, unfortunately, we have to give it up. So, I have talked about stress as the core driver for a lot of clinical imbalances. Now, let's look at what happens when you see a diagram like this. It's really shockingly clear. This is how our arteries look like. And you can see the layers, the constriction. This is what causes high blood pressure, atherosclerosis. The thinning, you see the blood is struggling to go through because the concentration of fat lining the arteries causes a lot of issues. You know, a lot of people thought it was all from calories, but now you can understand that. What triggers this? Number one is that if you're always stressed, then blood has to rush. When blood is rushing, it causes injury in the artery. And why is blood rushing? Because we are responding to stress. It causes injury in the artery. When there's injury in the artery, the body sends fat to try and calm that injury that is being created in the artery. And that's where the beginning of atherosclerosis begins. That injury, as the body is trying to repair that injury, it is supposed to be using the right phospholipids for repairing the walls. And then the whole challenge of cholesterol and how LDL and HDL that are carrying the good fats, which is cholesterol and the other things, to the right places, that's when the whole challenging journey begins. So let's just see from this diagram what is happening. So if it continues to accumulate the fat, or what we'll call cholesterol, when it continues to accumulate, then what is going to happen? Your blood pressure is going to rise, and then we're going to end up with three different things. Number one, there's going to be accumulation of the bad fats, LDL. Number two, there's going to be an accumulation of the good fats. Next week, we're going to go into real detail about this so that you understand the details. So let's look at it. We have, so when we're measuring, as we'll talk next week, there's LDL, there's HDL, and then there is what we call the triglycerides. So when we're talking about cholesterol carriage in the body, which is a very critical substance that's required, those are the three big things that we're measuring. We're measuring LDL, which is considered to be the bad fat, but it's not really the bad fat. So let's talk about a couple of myths. So people think that if I have a high HDL number, it means that I have a lower cardiovascular risk. That's not correct. Some people think that if I have a low LDL, then I have lower cardiometabolic risk. That's also not correct. So the issue of cardiometabolic risk has become very, very important, and there is a lot of new technologies and new ways of interpreting that risk. The challenge is that I don't want to spend a lot of time today on that. We're just going to do high level, because next week we're actually going to take sample reports from Boston Heart and Vibrant America and go deep into this issue of what are the values for HDL, what are the values for LDL, what are the values for triglycerides, and what are the things that drive. So let's talk about a couple of things. Number one, fats don't come from eating fat. That's a stupid idea. Well, if you eat bad fats, what are bad fats? They're saturated fats that come from processed food. All American foods processed contain the bad fats. Full stop. There is no good or bad. Animal fats are good fats. That's why people are encouraged to eat bacon or eat pork. You see, in the cultures where pork was eaten, everything is fine. It is the oils that we have created that are very bad as fats. So even if you look at, because you know, in our capitalist architecture, everything is about markets. So we extract corn oil, but then we do processing around it, and that's how we destroy it. So when you go to the village, they get corn oil or sesame oil or grapeseed oil. That's raw virgin oil. It's very good. It's good omega-3 fats. So there are a couple of things that we need to understand. The whole issue of talking about fats is a very complex issue. So let's explore it here. So it is important that we eat more foods that have omega-3s than foods, because most foods have omega-6. Omega-6 is good for us, but when it is overwhelmed in our bodies, it becomes a real problem. The omega-3s are the better fats, and they are the fats that the body actually prefers. But most foods have omega-6. And what is the top food that has omega-3? There are very few. And that's why even for cancer patients, they recommend flax seeds. Flax seeds have the highest component of omega-3. That's why flaxseed oil is the vegetarian alternative for omega-3. Or if you get the pure salmons and those fishes, or why do Koreans and Asians love anchovies? Because anchovies and sardines have omega-3s. They are the best fishes for getting omega-3. So if you really want to make sure you get the good fats, you need to make sure you're eating either flaxseed or grapeseed, or you're eating the fishes for people who don't have the allergy to seafood. So that's why, as part of our standard recommendation for supplements, you must take fish oil every day. You must. It is mandatory, because there is no way you can get enough omega-3, EPA and DHA. You cannot get enough of that from the food that you eat. And what is it doing? It's providing the body with the good fats, which are also necessary for calming down inflammation. On top of that, we also recommend you take SPM. As I just said, the COVID-19 viruses loves cells that are already inflamed, and they call those the inflammasome. So it looks for those cells, and that's where it lands and begins its attack. So when you lower your inflammation by taking SPM, which modulates inflammation, you are reducing the opportunity for the COVID-19 virus to land on those cells. It's very important if you look at all the literature for that. So if there's one very important food, and that's why people eat avocados also, because of the oils from the avocado. That's why avocado oil is so amazing. It's because of the underlying omega-3s and the function of these oils in the architecture of our body. Our body is 17% fat, good fat, about 17% protein, about 60% water, and the rest is the rest of those minerals. So let's talk about this myth, because most doctors, most nurses are ignorant of the underlying drivers of cardiometabolic health. So The concept of high-density lipoprotein cholesterol, which is HDL, as being beneficial dates back over 70 years ago. And in 77, the prominent Framingham, there was a study in Boston, Massachusetts called the Framingham study, demonstrated that low HDL cholesterol concentrations were associated with increased risk of coronary heart disease. So let me say something here as a statistician. So we build these models. What is the models we build? We say Y is equal to A plus BX plus CZ, right? Those are the risk models that are built in medicine to determine whether what we call these variables, what impact does this variable have on the outcome? So when we're trying to find out the variables that drive underlying risk for cardiometabolic, we begin to do measurements around that and come up with some of these silly research papers that influence thinking and practice and actually kill people. That's the case here. They said HDL measurement, cholesterol measurement, LDL measurement, and triglycerides were critical determinants for cardiovascular risk. And it's been found that's not true. And so it's a very delicate emerging area. So in 86, the second HDL measurement from that became available from long-term analysis, right? What's long-term analysis? They studied people over a long time. The first study was a short-term study, and they found out that the lowest 20% of HDL cholesterol levels had twice the risk. You see, this is the challenge when you're dealing with research. Now we get lost into the details. Low HDL cholesterol level was thus believed to be a risk factor for heart health. Next week, we're going to explore these numbers. We're going to realize that HDL has to be lower than a certain amount. HDL has to be higher than a certain amount. So everything that God created has an upper limit and a lower limit, and creates what we call a response surface, an optimized response area. It can be too low, it cannot be too high. It has to flow in that region. That's what we discovered with sugar. That's what we're discovering with fats, with HDL. So all the statistical measures are beginning to show us that in its precision, and that's why more and more I believe that God created man. It was not evolutionary, because these are very precise measurements. It's like somebody decided this is how the width and length should be. And I don't think that evolution could have driven that method. So from a real technology perspective, we are finding real precision. The numbers have to be around this, right? And that's why we see all the advanced diagnostic measures that we are now using. And so we've arrived at a new age where we are realizing that having very low, that's the challenge now, I was just summarizing. Having very low or very high HDL actually increases your risk of mortality. Right? What were they saying before? High HDL was good. That's wrong. If it's too high, you actually have risk of dying. See the point? So it's very interesting. So let's go back to the notes, and then let me talk to you about cardiometabolic risk. So look at the things about cardiometabolic disease. So let's talk one by one so we can cover this in its depth. Okay? I love it. Joanna, thank you for the labeling on those bags. Finally, we get the vision of what I really want. Why don't you just show those bags and let them see exactly what I was looking for? The bag shows exactly the IV they are receiving, the session for the IV, the name and the amount in the IV, right? Making the customer very comfortable that if they look up to the IV, they know exactly what they're receiving, right, customers? Thank you. Let's look at cardiometabolic. You see, cardiometabolic disease is the most important imbalances across these 10 imbalances. It is the most important disease in America. Let's look at it. We'll start at the top. The brain. Feeling of satiety. What is the feeling of satiety? Feeling that you've eaten enough. You know, in Japan, they say that by the time you feel like you've had enough food, you were full 20 minutes before that. So you need to eat and stop eating before you feel like you're full. It's a very challenging thing. Most times when you eat, it is after you stop that you realize you're already full. So that signal to the brain that I am full is a very challenging signal with cardiometabolic risk. And for most of us, that signal is not working very well. Then there's also the issue of inflammatory. Then let's look at the myocardium, right? That's the thing that covers the heart. There's free radical stress and perfusion leading to loss of function. Let's look at the arteries. Turbulent flow, right? That's what really starts the deposit of fat. It's the turbulent flow in the arteries. And what causes the turbulent flow? Stress. Really, it's at the source of it. I'm going down on the right, I'm looking at the arteries. Then inflammatory signals, occlusion of the lumen. What's the lumen? It's that inner wall in the artery that actually protects it from blood flow. And then there's perfusion. Once that tissue is damaged, right, then fat starts accumulating because that's a response to that. Macrophages, those are the things that are called in when we have disease or infection to fight. There's free radical stuff, there's inflammatory signaling, there's blood vessels. That's the big one, right? The smooth muscle contraction increases, increasing your blood pressure. There's vasoconstriction. That's also what leads to blood pressure. And there's nitric oxide production falls down. That's why, team, every time we have people come in here, we have Songhai is like thinking about yawning. Did we measure his nitric oxide? Both of them? Can we measure their nitric oxide levels so that we always record that as part of their visit, and also their glucose levels, okay? Then our capillaries are also damaged. And the damage is from the inflammatory signals, and there's increased growth, right? That's why if you have cardiometabolic disease, you also have microcirculation problems. They all just go together. It's challenging. Then you also have fat in your muscle. That's why when you climb on our machine, right, there should be no fat in the muscles. It should be lean beef, like a Wagyu, right? But some people climb on the Menla scan like me, and it will show fat in the muscles. That's not a good thing, okay? And then the fat in the stomach, right? And then it also, that is, why do you think we call them the vulnerables? When you have all these issues, the virus loves you. The virus finds cells that are already compromised. And then what's happening with the liver, with the fatty liver, right? Because don't forget that all this cholesterol that LDL and HDL are carrying, they're all going to the liver, because that's where the liver is actually going to store and process all that fat. Then the pancreas, I already spoke about the islets of Langerhans, that the beta cells are the ones that produce insulin and actually manage that whole glycemic dysregulation, right? Did you make only 3 copies? Okay, let's go to the next one. So let's just look at how complex cardiometabolic is. It's a very complex illness, and all of us suffer from it. Anybody who's above 40 has cardiometabolic illness, right? What is the initial predisposition? Now we're looking at risk. Look at the left-hand side. What's the predisposition? That's what? Genetics, age, and lifestyle. That's what I was talking about here, the causes. And what is the first big issue? Obesity. Did you see that? And where does obesity come from? The stress that comes from eating. People are not overeating. They just stress and then they eat. And how does that normally happen? You come back from working under Charles Sine after 8 hours. You get home and you're like, finally, like, he's not looking at me anymore. Now I can eat, right? And then you eat too much, right? Your response to working under a stressful leader is that you eat too much and you pay the price. Actually, the best thing you should do after working under a stressful leader is to go to the gym and punch a bag that looks like your boss. It's actually good for your health, rather than eating. So rather than take a spoon of ice cream or chocolate, go to the gym and paint Charles Sine on the wall and punch it and get some exercise and sweat and go home. But what's the second thing that drives it? Insulin resistance. What causes insulin resistance? Too much blood in the blood. I mean, too much sugar in the bloodstream. Sugar is our enemy. No excuse. Even if you're slim, you still have visceral fat. You would think that Asians will not die from cancer and cardiometabolic illnesses, but they do, because they also accumulate that fat. And once you accumulate that fat, it causes problems, right? So glucose causes insulin resistance that leads to that. The next one, hypertension, blood pressure. That comes from what? Atherosclerosis. What causes atherosclerosis is having too much fat in the blood, those bad fats, and then the body is like, where are we going to store this? And they have 3 storage points: liver, adipose, or the bloodstream. If they're in the bloodstream, they'll deposit it in the walls of the arteries, right? And then we have what we call the acute phase reactants, which is really the inflammation issues of CRP, fibrinogen. I'm not going to go into that. But let's look at the atherogenic dyslipidemia. I know these are all big words. Triglycerides are up. They say that's the first sign of chronic illness. HDL-C, the good cholesterol, is low. That's not a good thing, because the particles, and we'll talk about that next week, the particle sizes and what is carrying what, and the HDL function and all of that. We have a beautiful thing here. Where is it? Cardiolox HDL. This supplement is targeted support for HDL function and cardiovascular health. It's supposed to really optimize HDL metabolism and HDL function, which is really very good, right? So I've put out some supplements here today, and we're going to talk about them shortly. Then there's the triglycerides to HDL ratio, which is really about eating the good fats. And then there's also the increase in LDL, right? You see the formula there? Very complicated. Triglycerides going up, look at the arrow. HDL going down, triglyceride to HDL ratio going up, and LDL going up. Lots of confusing arrows. So if you look at all this detail, you're going to be like, wow, what do I need to do? Then let's look at the lipoprotein abnormalities. Okay, let's talk about this. What are lipoproteins? It's a beautiful name, lipoproteins. These lipoproteins are like those people who help you carry your bag. They're carriers of cholesterol, and they're of different sizes, right? I love lipoproteins. Their job is like carriers. They are slaves. They're carrying your cholesterol to the right places, right? And they have big particles for bigger load, small particles for smaller load, and they're all traveling in your bloodstream. God was very smart. Actually, sometimes I think that he must have given me some of his smartness, most of it. All right, let's look at this. Look at lipoprotein abnormalities. So I just told you what lipoproteins are. They're carriers of fat or cholesterol. You okay? Yeah. Good, all right. Water, everything is fine? All right, good, okay. So the APOB, it's a genetic mutation that some people have, and therefore they have a genetic susceptibility to cardiovascular bad health. And for a couple of us here, we have that, and it normally would be part of your Boston report. And if you have that mutation, it also increases your risk for Alzheimer's. That's just what we found out with that particular mutation. Increases your risk for cardiovascular and therefore for Alzheimer's. So when we do the diagnostics, you see all this data. Then, if you have smaller particle sizes, it's actually an abnormality, and also the particle number. We're going to talk about that next week when we actually look at some of the big reports that we use, especially the Boston report. And if you have not run the Boston report, then, especially if you're a woman and you're menopausal, then you don't actually understand your underlying risk, which is very high for menopausal women because of the hormonal issue. The highest risk for menopausal women is cardiovascular risk. It's not breast cancer. And so it's very important that menopausal women pay a lot of attention to this cardiovascular conversation. So I'm going to talk now about some of the supplements we have, and then we're going to close from there. Okay, am I doing well on time? Yes. I like that. Almost out of time. Let's look at circulatory issues, right? Most of us, as you saw from that diagram, have, as you grow older, you have a reduction of nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is very critical for supporting the vasodilation and the circulatory process, especially for people who have microcirculation problems, which is an effect of cardiometabolic, in that blood is not reaching all the extremities. So they begin to have tingling, numbness, they're always cold in their hands and their feet, and they're suffering from issues of circulation. So these three products, Boloke, Citronox, and Neo 40, are all nitric oxide products. We have a couple here also, and the Nox Synergy. So these four products are nitric oxide products, and I take, I think, all of them every day. I take mostly this and the powder every day. I also take Boloke because for people who actually have tingling or things like that already, this is a very, very important supplement from Canada that is highly, highly recommended. I already spoke about Cardiolox for HDL. We then have niacin, which is a very important supplement. It gives you that flush. It's very important for HDL and LDL. We have bergamot and lipitrol, ox, which are also part of that. For blood pressure, we have vasotensin and actually bergamot for managing blood pressure reduction. We then have berberine, and that's for glucose metabolism. So even if you're not eating sugar, and even if your glucose is within control, what we want to achieve with your glucose is actually something like that. This is really optimized glucose management. So even though you go to the doctors now and they'll say, oh, you're fine, but you actually want to make sure that your body's glucose control is really stable. It then causes what we call glycemic dysregulation. So berberine is a very good product for that. And then we have a metabolic synergy to address. Then we have phosphatidylcholine, which is the plaque X IV therapy that some of my guests are taking. And it says potential spam. And so we have phosphatidylcholine, which is actually a phospholipid. It's a bilipid, which is really very important. And what it does is that it goes and helps with the repair of the arteries. And because now we have the right lipids to repair the lumen, the cholesterol or the plaque that has accumulated has no value anymore. So it is slowly then released into the system for it to be excreted. And so that is, as we know, the research shows that after 10 or 20 or 30 treatments, you could actually clear all the plaque. But clearing the plaque doesn't mean the plaque will not build up again, right? So I know that you guys may want to be doing this every week for the rest of your lives, or you can stop eating sugar and change your diet, right? So that you don't have to do this all the time. And then we spoke about inflammation. So that's for glucose management. I thought it was GI replenish. And we have curcumin, which is like, you know, most of us don't like the smell of Indian food, but that is the key issue in Indian food, curcumin or turmeric. It's a very, very important supplement for the human body. It is really critical for managing inflammation. It's a they're finding out that this is almost like something that you should be taking almost daily or every time you eat. Then my most favorite product. This is a product that everybody must take every day if you want to be healthy and happy. And you will go to poo twice a day. And it's a pleasurable, long, snaky poo. It's very good for you. You feel better. You feel just amazing. And then the stomach is good and you sleep well. This I recommend for women, especially. It has more than 15 amino acids. So if you don't eat enough protein, this is very good. And then it heals the gut. This is a very, very important meal. If you don't take breakfast, you should take this, and it's chocolate. Again, right, you take something that is gonna make you feel good, and it also restores your architecture. So today what I've tried to do was to give you a large overview, as I said, of the multifactorial nature of cardiometabolic health. It's very complicated illness. It kills most Americans. It's very complicated and we don't have a cure for it. The only way is through lifestyle interventions and addressing the underlying issues that the body has to deal with, right? And as I said, the biggest one is stress. Right? And what did I say the big issue about stress is? Lack of control. So how do you have control? You make sure you have enough money, or you spend below your ability to make money. You use your time very well. You don't waste time. So social distancing is very good. You stay by yourself. You have great relationships. And you build the knowledge by listening to my workshops, right? And then next week, we're going to look at diagnostics. We're going to look at two big diagnostic reports that we use, Boston Heart Diagnostics and Vibrant America. And the Boston Diagnostic Report looks at inflammation, metabolics, genetics and the lipid panel. And also we'll look at Vibrant America, which looks at the underlying micronutrients in the bloodstream and in the cellular level. Then we would look at interventions in session 3 and session 4. So any questions? Thank you today for joining us and for being patient. Even though I went over time, these classes are supposed to last 1 hour, but there was a lot for discussion today, and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.